Ivar the Boneless. Though shrouded by legend and historical skepticism, Ivar the Boneless is regarded as one of the most famous Viking raiders of all time, credited as the mastermind behind the Scandinavian invasion of 9th century Ireland and Britain. But who was this mysterious figure, and what impact did he have on history? Who was his family, and how did he come to power? And was he actually boneless?
It's long been debated whether Ivar the Boneless was a real historical man or simply a combination of several 9th century Danish figures. There are three main sources which support his existence as a singular, if legendary, individual, all of which were written around 300 years after he is said to have lived. So allow me to introduce you to the Ivar of legend described in these sources. Perhaps the most famous of the three is the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, a 13th century Icelandic work. This work describes Ivar as being the son of famous Danish sea king Ragnar Lothbrok and Ragnar's second wife, Aslaug. The saga goes on to describe Ivar as being a handsome, clever man who was incredibly skilled at warfare and tactics. Ragnar and Aslaug are said to have had at least 4 more sons after Ivar, including Sigurd Snake in the Eye, Bjorn Ironside, Hvitserk, and Ragnvald. As you can imagine, family dinners were probably a pretty rowdy affair. Combined with the other 2 sources, the Gesta Danorum and the Tale of Ragnar's Sons, both of which are also 13th century works, we get the picture of a military mastermind, one who followed in his father's footsteps as an ambitious warrior Viking. The Ivar of legend wasn't your average Viking. Like all other Danes, he would have been raised to be a Valhalla-worthy, fearless Viking, but what set him apart from the pack was his cunning ingenuity and skill, especially when it came to military strategy and leadership. It's said that as a young man, he and his brothers would roam the territories of Denmark and Sweden, looking for opportunities to assert their dominance and make a name for themselves, just as their father had. Legend has it that Ivar even managed to kill the king of Sweden's magical cow, Sibilja, bringing down the beast with only a bow and arrow. These displays of power obviously earned Ivar the approval of his father, Ragnar, who is said to have left him in charge of his kingdom in Denmark while Ragnar himself sailed for England. Unfortunately, trouble soon found Ragnar in England. Ella, the king of Northumbria, is said to have captured the Danish leader off of the coast and thrown him to his death in a pit of vipers once he found out who the king was. Upon hearing of his father's death, the Tale of Ragnar's Sons tells us that Ivar traveled to England and asked Aela for a large portion of Northumbrian land. Seemingly oblivious to whatever this strange Ivar fellow might be scheming, Aela allowed Ivar as much land as he could cover with a bullhide, or so the story goes. The cunning Ivar then cut the hide into dozens of thin strips, laying it around the Northumbrian city of York. The tale tells us that after this, Ivar spent some time building up local connections before sending for his brothers to come across the channel and get their revenge on Aela. The brothers landed in East Anglia and set their sights toward the city of York, rejoining Ivar there and executing Aela. When it came to getting revenge for his father, Ivar pulled no punches. Aela's death is the thing of horror films. Ripping his enemy open from the back and pulling out his lungs like 2 hideous wings, Ivar is said to have brought rest to his father by carving the blood eagle on his enemy's back. After executing Aela, the Tale of Ragnar's Sons tells us that Ivar became a local king in England, ruling for a few years in Northumbrian York before his death, with no children to come after him or carry on his legacy because of his boneless condition. And this brings us to an interesting digression. What exactly was the story behind Ivar's famous sobriquet? And again, the sources disagree. Some more PG-13 legends suggest that it was Ragnar's eagerness on his wedding night that produced a son with gristle in the place of bones. Other sources claim that it was Ivar's own fertility that merited this nickname. Still others say it was a reference to his great agility in battles, and a few make absolutely no reference to his being boneless at all. The tale of Ragnar's sons does say that Ivar was an excessively large man who had to be carried everywhere on a stretcher by his brothers, but who made up for his disability with his formidable upper body strength and great skill with a bow. These legendary accounts also each tell a slightly different story of Ivar's final years. The Gesta Danorum claims that Ivar did rule for a while in England, but then died in Denmark. However, from Irish annals, we historically hear of Ivar's death as taking place in 873 in Dublin. Ivar's whereabouts after his invasion into Britain is just one more thing the legends don't clarify, and even historians aren't exactly sure how Ivar spent the later years of his life.
Alright, enough of those nonsensical legends. We have to tell these folks about the real Ivar. And that's just the problem. Modern historians aren't entirely sure who the real Ivar was. As best as we can gather, Ivar was indeed the son of Ragnar Lothbrok, and he did play an instrumental role in the Viking invasion of Britannia. Still, as mentioned earlier, it is important to remember that Ivar could have been a combination of several different historical figures whose collective impact was enough to create the legendary man we now know as Ivar the Boneless. On a side note, go ahead and ignore what that mystical wacko said about its bonelessness. Ivar's nickname resulted either from the bone disease osteogenesis imperfecta or from a familial jest bestowed upon him by his brothers. Most likely, it was a simple tongue in cheek token of tough brotherly love, since a crippled man would have not made it very far in a society who viewed disabled people as inferior. Little is known of Ivar's early life. The date and location of his birth are not recorded, and the first we hear of a prominent warrior Viking named Ivar comes from the Irish annals, and they spell it Imar, but it's still pronounced Ivar. In 857, this Ivar began sowing discord among the Irish kings, likely in pursuit of his own political ends. Ivar is said to have been supported by his kinsman Olaf the White, who was the Danish king of Dunlin. Although it is possible that this Ivar was the same as the Hingvar who would later invade Britain, this sadly isn't a provable fact. King Aella of Northumbria certainly existed and was reigning in 865 AD when the great heathen army arrived on the Isle of Thanet in Kent. The army was unlike anything ever seen by the Anglo-Saxons. It was a force hundreds of ships strong, each ship carrying dozens of Danish, Norse, and Swede warriors. The army had come together from Ireland, Frisia, Francia, Scandinavia, and Pictland, intent on launching a full-scale invasion of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The invasion force was well led, organized, and tactically sophisticated with efficient lines of communication, allowing them high mobility. The match that supposedly lit this invasion was King Aella's execution of Ragnar Lothbrok, who was Ivar's famous father. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a collection of annals which recorded important events in Anglo-Saxon history, tells us that three men named Hingvar, Uba, and Halfdane were the leaders of the Great Army, Hingvar being an early version of the name Ivar. Although the story of the bullhide in the city of York is likely fictitious, we do know that Ivar, alongside his brothers Huva and Halfdane, led the mighty heathen force into East Anglia, keeping camp there until winter passed. In the spring, the great army with supplies, money, and horses from King Edmund of East Anglia moved into Northumbria, a once mighty kingdom that had fallen on hard times in the 9th century. The area had been wrecked by various civil wars, and in 858, the rightful King Osbert was ousted by King Aella, meaning Northumbria was weak and susceptible to the Great Army invasion. Everwick, a city later known as York, was a major node on the Roman road network and served as a prime target for the Great Army as they sought to secure a foothold in the region. Riding from the south on horses and taking the fleet up the coast, Ivar chose All Saints' Day on November 1st to attack York, ultimately capturing the city in 866. This attack forced Osbert and Aella to set aside their differences in face of the great foe. But the Battle of Everwick in 867 ended with a disastrous loss by the Northumbrians, and the city of York became a Viking stronghold with the puppet king Egbert overlooking things. Ivar executed King Aella and then advanced his forces into the kingdom of Mercia, likely confident that their success in East Anglia and Northumbria would be repeated. A terrified King Burgred of Mercia called the Wessex king King Ethelred and future King Alfred to fight against the oncoming great army. Eventually, Burgred forked out a Danegeld and the great army withdrew to York. At this point, Ivar returned his attention to defeating East Anglia. In 869, King Edmund was captured and martyred by Ivar and his men. At this point, it may come as no surprise to you that Ivar's reputation as a cruel man is well recorded in a historical fact, with the German medieval chronicler Adam of Bremen calling him the most gruesome of all the Danish petty kings who ravaged Francia. As with this unfortunate Ayla, Ivar showed little mercy to the defeated King Edmund. Scandinavian scholar Robert Ferguson tells us that Edmund was seized and tied to a tree to be whipped. As Edmund cried out to Christ, Ivar's men used him as target practice with bows and arrows. Ivar grew increasingly angry as the king refused to denounce his faith, so spears were then thrown at Edmund. Finally, the steadfast Christian was beheaded. Ivar's show of power had a massive effect on the East Anglian people. Unsurprisingly, Edmund's brother, next in line for the East Anglian throne, fled the kingdom instead of facing Ivar's encroaching army. The story of Edmund's grisly death likely spread an overwhelming feeling of terror towards the invading Vikings, causing the grim situation to worsen for the Anglo-Saxons. The great army's devastation of East Anglia and Northumbria provided a foothold for the Viking presence in Britannia, a grip they would hold for the next 2 centuries, all thanks to the clever, cruel leadership of Ivar and his brothers. Supposedly, Ivar didn't participate in the campaign to take Wessex from King Alfred in the 870s. After the attack on Nottingham and Mercia, it's assumed he got back together with Olaf the White and headed north to Scotland, where in 870 the two attacked Dumbarton Rock, which was the capital of the Brythonic kingdom of Alclut.
Dumbarton Rock was a key strategic location and fortress, and it was besieged for 4 months by Ivar the Boneless and Olaf the White. The defenders did not have the determination or the resources compared to the Vikings, which eventually led to them surrendering the fortress. This led to the fall of Alclut in 871. The citadel was razed and its defenders were slain, while the survivors were taken to be sold at the slave markets of Dublin and York. This was a determined political move and gave more power to Ivar the Boneless in the region.
So the question is, did Ivar stay on mainland Britain through his later years, or did he die in Dublin? As previously noted, there is indeed a Viking leader named Ivar recorded by the Irish Annals of Ulster as dying in Dublin in the year 873. But after the 17th century excavations of the Great Army base in Repton, England, allegedly uncovering the skeleton of a 9 foot tall man, some historians argue that the bones belong to Ivar, and that Repton is his true resting place.
Repton was home to the Great Heathen Army in the winter of 873, and 873 is the date that some historians think that Ivar passed away. Naturally, this causes speculation that some of the bones and skeletons found at Repton belong to Ivar the Boneless. It isn't confirmed, but it is speculation.
So, considering the two proposed burial sites, is it possible that there were two different Ivars, one in England and one in Ireland? It is difficult to say. Perhaps Ivar felt confident leaving the continual subjugation of Wessex to his brother Halfdane and decided to spend some time raiding in Scotland before returning to Ireland. Maybe the bones in Repton belonged to a different, unnamed Danish warrior. But here, the lines between historical fact and myth are still fuzzy, shrouded in legendary speculation.
All right, come on. You have to admit that a lot of what we know about Ivar is drawn from legendary sources. That doesn't mean he wasn't a real person who had a real impact.
Okay, maybe you have a point there. Details of his life aside, Ivar's short-term impact as a historical figure is clear enough. He took the initiative to invade Britain, likely spurred on by a desire to follow his dearly departed father's footsteps as an expansionist. The devastation of Northumbria, East Anglia, and eventually Mercia by Ragnar's sons served as a critical foothold for later Viking raids, and in the long run provided for the formation of the Danelaw in 878. Perhaps it was only the lack of manpower that stopped the Viking army from taking full control of England at this time. At any rate, they certainly made an impressive dent into the territory. From another angle, the Great Army's invasion may be one of the reasons that the kingdoms of England eventually became united. Without the threat of the Great Army to serve as a turning point, it is likely that Britannia would have continued on as a group of divided kingdoms. But a common foe can unite even the worst of enemies, and the bloodthirsty Viking force was certainly a very real threat to all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Further, it could also be argued that Ivar's invading army was the fire which forged Alfred the Great into the formidable military leader and king he would turn out to be. In other words, without leaders like Ivar and his brothers, there may have been no great army, and without his great army, there would never have been Alfred the Great. And without Alfred the Great, whose later actions would eventually lead to the unification of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, there would likely be no Britain as we now know it. Maybe it's a stretch, but recognizing the role Ivar played in molding modern day England helps us better see the interconnected, dependent nature of historical events.
So, to the best of our knowledge, Ivar the Boneless was indeed a real, singular, flesh and blood person, one who lived a fully Viking life, and whose legacy was so great it quickly became wreathed in legend. Even though the information concerning him is somewhat scattered, we know enough to form a picture of a truly remarkable warrior who led the great heathen army to an almost complete annexation of England, and whose idea of retirement was to wreak havoc in Scotland. I'll admit, it is important to keep in mind how Ragnar Lothbrok's renown as a legendary figure probably influenced later stories about Ivar. The Norse family certainly held the family in pretty high esteem, eventually attributing what can only be described as a godlike status to both Ivar and Ragnar, a status which comes through pretty clearly in the later Icelandic sources which recount their lives.
Well, I'm glad we finally found something we can both agree on.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is Ivar the Boneless, the man, the myth, the legend, but most importantly, a warrior hearted Viking who certainly earned himself an exalted place in the halls of Valhalla.